This conference will now be recorded. This conference will now be recorded.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. First and foremost, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for taking the time out of your day and joining me on this webinar, which is the fourth in the current series from Cass Allen. Today's talk is going to focus on the 5 W's of construction monitoring, which I'll present in the order that you see on the screen from left to right, with a summary to finish. Please feel free to type questions as we go through, and you'll notice that on the GoToMeeting there is a chat portion. As I say, please feel free to type them in as and when we go, and that way there will be a formal Q&A at the end, and my colleague Sam, who sat next to me, is going to be writing down and making a note of questions as they come. Before I jump in, I'll give you a little bit of background about me for the benefit of those of you who I haven't liaised with before. I'm a senior consultant with the firm. I've been a practicing consultant now for 12 years and counting. My specialist area is in environmental acoustics. I manage all the construction assessment and monitoring services for the firm, and I'm usually the first port of call for any inquiries of this nature. So without further ado, let's begin. So the first W that I want to tackle is why. Why do developers need to carry out construction monitoring? Well, quite simply, it's either because they have to or because they choose to. Chapter 40 of the Control and Pollution Act gives local authorities powers for controlling noise and vibration from construction sites and other similar works in England, Wales and Scotland. And I'm now briefly going to discuss 3 examples of where mandatory monitoring is required, as shown on the screen on the right. The first is Section 60 notices. So Section 60 of the Control of Pollution Act enables a local authority to serve a notice on a developer or contractor imposing restrictions on construction works. Conditions may be imposed at any time and without prior warning or consultation, although it is usual for local authorities to engage with developers prior to serving a notice. A Section 60 notice could be included as part of conditions attached to a planning consent before the commencement of work if a local authority believes that there will be a high likelihood of complaints being received. Alternatively, they can also be imposed after work has started. So the notice may restrict demolition and construction activities in a number of different ways. So in the example planning conditions shown on the right of the screen, the developer is required to monitor noise and dust levels using an objective method, i.e. physically measure noise and dust levels, submit the monitoring methodology, including the frequency and the location, to the local planning authority, agree baseline levels of dust and noise with the local planning authority prior to the commencement of works, agree action thresholds with the local planning authority for dust and noise, and to take action in the event of exceedances to reduce emissions to comply with the agreed levels. Other restrictions that are also typical can include specifying the type of plant that can be employed, for example using continuous flight augers instead of driven piles, specifying the time of days when certain plant or activities might be undertaken, or more commonly the hours of general site operation, which are typically 8 AM to 6 PM weekdays and 8 AM to 2 PM on Saturdays. Typically no construction works are allowed on Sundays or bank holidays without written prior consent from the local planning authority. So it's worth pointing out at this point that a Section 60 notice can be made more onerous if a local authority receives and upholds complaints from nearby sensitive receptors, and this can have significant implications for the programming and costs of the work. But a key point to bring out here is that failure to comply with a Section 60 notice is an offence without what's known as being called reasonable excuse, and can lead to a financial penalty, risks of works being stopped, or ultimately prosecution in a magistrate's court. So it needs to be taken very seriously. Moving on, the next thing that we'll look at is a Section 61 consent and application. So alternative to a Section 60 notice, a developer may apply to the local authority for prior consent to start work under a Section 61 agreement. This is usually something that we'll recommend for contentious sites where dust, noise or vibration emissions are likely to be an issue. The agreement must be completed prior to the start of construction work and requires the contractor or developer, typically in conjunction with their acoustics consultant, to provide more detailed information on the works and the method by which they'll be carried out, and measures to minimise emissions resulting from the works. So again, the example condition that we've shown on the screen again sets out a number of requirements that the developer and contractor must follow as part of the Section 61 consent. This includes carrying out real-time monitoring as per the acoustician's recommendations, that noise monitoring should be carried out at permanent and semi-permanent locations and include attended measurements as spot checks where required, that the results of the monitoring should be made available to the local authority over the internet, and that the results should be submitted to the local authority every month, and that in the event of complaints or breaches of the agreed trigger or action levels, the local authority might request results at shorter time intervals. Minimising emissions to acceptable levels require consideration of something called best practical means, which should have regard to both the local conditions and circumstances that prevail at the time, the current state of technical knowledge, and any financial implications of any potential alternatives. The developer's acoustic consultant should be able to provide expert advice in relation to best practical means, which could include mitigation and management measures that could be incorporated to reduce emissions, and if necessary, the consideration of alternative construction techniques. It's worth pointing out that a well-developed and negotiated Section 61 consent can provide developers and their contractors with relative certainty that their works can progress uninterrupted. As a key point is that local authorities cannot serve a Section 60 notice at any time, provided that the developer adheres to the conditions stipulated in the Section 61 consent. It's also advantageous to the local authority as it allows them to engage with developers and contractors at an early stage and establish good lines of communication. Ultimately, this should provide the local authority with reassurance that due consideration and attention is being given to the potential for emissions from the works to affect premises within the vicinity. Moving on to the last one, a party wall award, or otherwise known as a party wall agreement, is the document that's produced by two party wall surveyors acting for respective owners where construction will take place. It commonly includes a schedule of condition reports, details relating to the manner in which works will be undertaken, and conditions that need to be fulfilled throughout the works, which can typically include a requirement for vibration monitoring to reduce the risk of structural damage. Again, in the example shown on screen, this condition requires the building owner to install a vibration sensor inside the building of interest and to record, monitor and report on ground-borne vibration and noise, take baseline or ambient noise levels 1 week prior to the commencement of the works, agree acceptable levels of noise and vibration for the works and to adjust these accordingly, and finally to provide detailed method statements of the installation and weekly reports. More and more recently, we've actually started to see examples of developers and contractors opting to carry out construction monitoring, regardless of whether or not there's actually any mandatory requirements for them to do so. This is often managed through their preferred acoustic consultants, and this is beneficial for two main reasons. Firstly, having an acoustician oversee the monitoring throughout the works provides a single point of contact in the event of any queries or issues. It's not uncommon, particularly for large projects, for developers to have several different subcontractors appointed throughout the works. And if they tender for monitoring separately, this means that the developer or principal contractor could find themselves having to review multiple different proposals, which can be a waste of their time and resources. And secondly, voluntarily carrying out monitoring builds trust between a developer and a local authority, and it will likely provide the local authority with reassurance that the developer are likely to operate the site in a responsible and respectful manner. In our experience, it is always better to be proactive rather than reactive. Take community engagement by way of example. If a developer is proactive with community engagement throughout works, then it's far less likely that complaints will arise as a result. However, in the converse situation, if community liaison is poor, then this could potentially create problems for the developers, as human reaction to noise and vibration is very subjective, and it can be very difficult for people to shake off perceived concerns once they take hold. So moving on, the next topic that we'll look at is what? What are the key factors that are affecting construction monitoring? In our experience, you can break these down into two different categories as shown on the screen. Firstly, equipment issues, and secondly, site issues. I'll address each in turn now. There is a wide variety of commercial monitoring equipment that's available, and it can easily be overwhelming for a non-acoustician to choose between them given so much choice. A selection of some of the various monitoring devices currently available are being cycled on screen now. As independent consultants, Cass Allen are not tied to any particular equipment supplier, and we regularly review the market to ensure that the monitoring equipment that we use or recommend for our clients is suitable. And by suitable, there are three key aspects that we consider when evaluating the suitability of the hardware. Firstly, is the equipment fit for purpose? i.e. will it provide all the functionality that the developer will need to fulfill any mandatory requirements that have been imposed? Secondly, is the equipment reliable and from a reputable supplier with a proven track record? And last but by no means least, does the equipment offer good value for money? And by that, it's worth stressing that this is not the same as purchasing the cheapest available equipment. Choosing the right equipment for a project is a key aspect of the process, and it's worth investing the time and money to get this right, as in our experience it will save money and resources in the long run. One of the first things that we'll do at Castlelyn upon receipt of a construction monitoring inquiry is call the project manager and discuss the project in order to fully understand the specific requirements. Then and only then are we able to offer appropriate advice and recommendations to the client so that they can make an informed decision. Now, if you recall from the earlier slides on why, there can often be mandatory requirements relating to the monitoring devices, such as the need for real-time monitoring via a web-based interface or the triggering of alerts when specific thresholds have been breached. In our professional opinion, there are 3 key monitoring must-haves that we always think should be considered. For noise, monitoring devices should be capable of recording audio. This is necessary to differentiate between construction and non-construction related events in the event of any potential litigation claims. And a common example that we often come across is if you've got a site that's located close to a main road, it's not uncommon to have things like motorbike pass-bys or emergency sirens which trigger off alerts, which clearly aren't construction related. So where we do have audio recording, we're able to disregard those events. For vibration, the monitoring devices should identify frequency that has caused any exceedances. This is because construction activities typically generate low frequency content, and if the sensor is picking up vibration outside of these frequencies, then it could be sending false alerts. And finally, for dust, monitoring devices should be MCERTs. This is the Environment Agency's monitoring certification scheme, which is built around proven international and European standards. This ensures that monitoring data is of a high standard. Moving on to site constraints, there are 3 Ps that are common potential issues that we need to address on most sites. The first is power. The most effective way to ensure that data is monitored continuously on the site is to provide mains power to the monitors. Most monitors available are capable of running off either 240 or 110 volt power, and we would always recommend that 110 volt power is used wherever practicable for health and safety reasons. If mains power isn't possible, then there are alternative options that can be considered, such as the provision of external batteries or solar panels. However, these options are generally not recommended because they involve additional costs and usually can lead to technical issues on site. For example, it's very easy to break solar panels if they're not handled with care, and we often rely on site personnel being trained to change external batteries where required. The second is placement, which I'll address in more detail shortly when we get to the subtopic on where. And finally is personnel, and by that I mean effective site management, because in order for construction monitoring to be successful, there has to be effective two-way communication between the people who are managing the monitoring on behalf of the developer or the contractor and the developer's site management team. For example, in the event of regular exceedances, the adopted construction monitoring lists or following actions should be taken. Firstly, a site manager should investigate the cause of the exceedance, and if not a site manager, then an appointed person in their stead. Secondly, if construction related, then the manager or appointed person should ensure that the activity is causing the alert is carried out in such a way as to minimize emissions and prevent further exceedances wherever practicable. And finally, the site manager or appointed person should inform the acoustician of the cause of the alert, who would then document it for reporting purposes where required. In our opinion, the above process and protocol effectively demonstrates best practicable means. Moving on, the next W that we'll address is who. Who should be carrying out monitoring? Well, hopefully, as you've likely picked up from the discussion on the previous 2 subtopics, the construction monitoring can be both political and technically complex, and therefore our recommendations would be as follows. Firstly, the monitoring needs to be carried out by a competent person or firm, and by this we mean that the person or firm has the necessary skills and experience to carry out the work required. Typically, they'll have membership to appropriate bodies such as the one shown on screen, which demonstrates that a specific level of training has been carried out and competence is reached. Secondly, the monitoring will ideally be carried out by an impartial person or firm. And by that, I mean that somebody who's not linked to the scheme, because in our experience, local authorities prefer it when third parties carry out the monitoring rather than contractors themselves, as it is a specialist area. And finally, that the monitoring should be carried out by people who are also able to provide professional guidance and advice in the event that any mitigation or management strategies need to be adopted to demonstrate best practical means. This often then rules out either subcontractors, developers, or equipment suppliers themselves. Moving on, the next thing to consider is when monitoring should be carried out. So typically this will be during 1 or 2 stages, or possibly both. It could be prior to work starting on site, and if you recall the earlier planning condition that we showed as an example, it included a requirement for baseline levels of dust and noise to be agreed prior to the commencement of the demolition and construction works. Now, the wording of the condition in this instance is such that it doesn't necessarily mean that the baseline levels of noise need to be carried out immediately prior to the construction works commencing. For example, if a noise survey has been carried out as part of the planning approval, which is typical, although not always mandatory, it may be possible to reuse this data and agree with the local authority, provided that noise has not changed significantly in the intervening period between the consent being granted and the work starting. However, if no such survey was carried out, then it is likely that a local authority would want to see objective levels in order to agree acceptable trigger and action levels for the works. So we'd usually recommend that baseline or pre-construction monitoring is carried out for at least 1 week prior to works commencing on site. Alternatively, if it could be during the onset of potential significant construction phases, which I'm going to discuss briefly now. So the table shown on screen shows the various different construction phases for a project. Depending on the size and complexity of the project, 1 or more of the phases may actually not be necessary, and similarly, any monitoring required would also be expected to be proportionate to the size and complexity of the project, as well as the likelihood that the activities could cause a disturbance. Typically, an acoustician would discuss these requirements with the developer, as well as with the local authority environmental health officer prior to the commencement of the monitoring starting, as and where required. So during the demolition phase of a project, this often involves the removal of existing buildings via mechanical means, and can include the use of heavy machinery and impact power tools such as pneumatic breakers and peckers, so on and so forth. It's therefore very likely that monitoring would need to be carried out for dust, noise and vibration during this particular phase of works. Similarly, site preparation and enabling works often also includes the transport of materials both onto and away from the site using heavy machinery such as tracked excavators, dumpers and lorries, and can also include the use of vibratory rollers in order to level the site. So it's also typical to monitor dust, noise and vibration during this phase as well. When we get to piling activities, these are usually generating significant noise and or vibration emissions depending on the type of piling method that's employed. And in our experience, it's often the phase of works that local authorities are most nervous about, given the potential for complaints depending on the proximity of sensitive receptors to site. So dust monitoring may also or may not be required during this phase, and this is indicated on screen by the question mark and the phone symbols. Often construction emissions typically reduce once the piling works are completed, and therefore concreting works and general construction activities don't typically generate as much emissions as the earlier phases of work, as there's less reliance of the use of heavy machinery and impact power tools. Furthermore, as the superstructure works progress, the buildings themselves can provide a degree of screening to nearby sensitive receptors. So throughout all the phases and these stages, it may be possible to negotiate early removal of any monitoring equipment with a local authority. This will likely be dependent on 3 things. Firstly, the local attitudes to the works. Secondly, whether or not there have been any validated complaints during the previous work phases. And finally, how the local authority perceives the contractor operating the site. I'll end this section with a short video clip which shows an example of driven piling technique that's been carried out on a site in the centre of Slough, which was constrained on all but one side by surrounding residential and commercial uses. Despite the fact that very high levels of noise and perceptible vibration were generated by the works, there was only one complaint raised throughout that we were made aware of. The developer successfully resolved this by agreeing to place the affected person in temporary office accommodation so that they can continue to complete the work over the 2-week period. I hope the video was smooth for you on your screens and the audio came through clearly on that one. So finally, we'll look at where monitoring should be carried out. There are generally 3 points that we'll consider when evaluating where it should be carried out. Firstly, that the location or locations should be representative of nearest affected sensitive receptors to the works. And by this, we mean dwellings, schools, hospitals, and places of worship. These are examples of what we would term as highly sensitive receptors. And also, this can also include offices and commercial industrial premises, but these are usually less sensitive premises or receptors. Secondly, we'd also seek to carry out the monitoring at as few locations as practicable and necessary. Monitoring can have significant cost implications, and we're very conscious that developers don't have a bottomless pot of money to invest in any monitoring. So we will always seek to challenge local authorities if we feel that unnecessary amount of monitoring is being requested, and this can be challenged from a technical grounds. And finally, that monitoring should be carried out at secure locations so as to minimise the risk of theft or damage. Typically, monitoring units will be locked in Peli cases and chained to existing structures wherever feasible. I'm now going to show photographs of 3 typical monitoring setups and locations that we've been involved on projects that we've completed in the past. The first one shows a recent installation of noise, vibration, dust and gas monitoring units at a site in London. The dust and gas units have been secured to the site hoarding, and the microphone of the noise monitoring unit has been secured to a pole and then fixed to the site hoarding. The vibration monitor has been placed on hard standing and shown at the bottom of the image and secured to the adjacent concrete plinth. In all cases, all of the instruments are powered by 110 site power, and you can hopefully just make out the site transformer in the bottom of the image. The nearest sensitive receptors to the site are the block of residential apartments, which is shown in the background of the image. The second image which we're showing shows a noise monitor that's been installed at a purpose-built off-site enclosure with the nearest sensitive apartments located behind in the background of the image. This was required in this particular instance as it wasn't possible to install the monitoring equipment within the site boundary. And thirdly, the image is showing a recent installation of a vibration sensor which has been fixed rigidly to a party wall and is powered by 110 volt site power. So I'm going to end this section on a little quiz for you all. Apologies. So given what you've just learned about where preferred monitoring positions should be, where would you place the monitor in the examples shown on screen? Location A, B, C or D? And I'll give you a couple of 30 seconds or so just to have a guess. So in our view, location A is most appropriate in this instance as it's representative of the nearest and most sensitive receptor to the works, which is the residential tower block located directly adjacent to the western boundary. So to summarise, the key take-home points that we'd like you to take from the webinar are as follows. That monitoring can be carried out in response to either compulsory requirements, be it planning obligations or consent via a formal Section 61 application or party wall awards, or it could be voluntarily, usually as part of a developer's strategic environmental objectives. That the main factors to consider are equipment hardware and site constraints, and it's worth investing the time upfront to get these right, as in our experience it will save time and money in the long run. That the monitoring should be carried out by competent persons who can also give professional advice where it's required. That the monitoring should be carried out either prior to works commencing and or during all significant stages of the works, that have the potential to generate significant emissions. And that finally, monitoring should be carried out at representative locations to nearby sensitive receptors, and ideally as at a few locations as is necessary. Thank you all very much for your time. I hope you found the talk informative, and we'll now answer any questions that you might have. Yes, please feel free to type any questions in the chat box, and then we'll respond to them as they come in.
We had a few questions come in via email before we started. So while people are typing away, we'll just deal with those. So the first question was, when should developers and contractors get in touch with the acoustician to make sure that the equipment's available and everything can be done in time?
It's a good question. Ideally, as soon as possible. In most cases, equipment could be ordered from suppliers fairly quickly. We'd normally say, just to be cautious, give us about either 1 or 2 weeks lead-in time, although it is dependent on specific requirements. If you are short on timescales, please let us know, and we will endeavour to get equipment as quick, as fast as we're able to source it, really.
The other question that email asked was, do all local authorities require it?
Not all local authorities. As we said in the talk, it will often depend on the size and the scale of the works that have been involved. We're typically finding that more and more local authorities are getting stretched with resources. So whilst ultimately local authorities have a duty to inspect sites from time to time as part of their statutory obligations, with resources being stretched, they're now placing that emphasis on developers and their third parties to carry this out on their behalf. What we're often seeing that is in London in particular, a lot of local authorities have code of construction practices, and they've been written in to include monitoring more often than not. Whereas in smaller local authorities, they'll often get more opportunity to liaise with the developer, so they'll be decided on an as and when basis.
Chris asks, how long does it take to set up the equipment?
That's a good question. Often we'll do as much of the equipment set up in terms of the hardware before we leave our offices. So that will include looking at data and making sure that we can communicate with the monitors effectively. When we actually get to site, the installation generally takes anywhere between an hour and maybe half a day, depending on the number of monitors that need to be installed and the size and complexity of the site.
And this was also an email question. You touched on it during the talk, but they want to know, what's the risk if they don't carry out monitoring and they start getting complaints?
It's a good question. I think ultimately it depends on where those complaints are sent to. It'll usually happen in one of two forms. Either a complaint will come in directly to the developer or the contractor, which is preferable, because then that gives the opportunity for the developer or contractor to respond. If it goes directly to the local authority, then a local authority has a statutory duty to investigate complaints that are received within their borough. So often they will engage then with the contractor to find out what they are doing and make sure that they are implementing best practical means. So often what most developers will have in place prior to work starting is something called a construction environmental management plan, and that will often detail any management or mitigation measures that the contractor says that they will implement throughout a construction works. So usually a local authority will check back at that document and then liaise with the with the developer to ensure that they're carrying that out. They may even decide to attend site in person just to ensure that those activities are being carried out. If it's unsatisfactory, often what they'll do at that point is speak to the contractor and then perhaps give them a warning before taking any further action to make sure that those obligations are being fulfilled.
Right. Scott Green asks, in your experience, how often do local authorities insist on noise dust monitoring? Is it usually a planning requirement?
It's a good question. It's not often a planning requirement, because typically a planning condition that will come in will just say would like, or a local authority would want to see a construction environmental management plan. As part of that process, they may request that an assessment is carried out of the likely predicted impact during the construction phase. Depending on what that prediction shows, that assessment shows, will then ultimately inform whether or not you need to then do it for monitoring. With part of a Section 61 application, I would say that more often than not, monitoring would be required, because it tends to be the basis by which you can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that you are fulfilling the obligations that have been imposed as part of any consent.
Debbie asks, once deployed, how do we know if the equipment is working?
It's a good question. That will often depend on what equipment that you put out. And so the difference usually between construction monitoring equipment and, say, just ordinarily, for example, sound level meters that may be used by consultants, is that the difference is that often the construction monitoring equipment has what's called a modem in, and that then enables two-way communication between the device and the internet in most cases. So most consultants are able to look in real time if the equipment is working. So then they'll be able to log in and remotely, either from their office, or we can give login details to clients or contractors to then be able to check on those monitors. And similarly, a lot of the equipment hardware has the capability to send either email or text alerts if power drops out or there's a malfunction with the equipment. So you usually know instantly if there's any problems.
And do contractors get real-time alerts of exceedances as well as equipment malfunctions?
They can do. Ultimately, it depends on how much information that the contractors want. If they want to be included on those kinds of emails, then they absolutely can do. And again, that would usually be either sent via email or SMS to directly to personnel. Often we say that that will get sent to the site management and possibly also the project manager. And if the site either is obligated to or is transparent and wants to, we can include local authorities on that chain so that they're kept informed at all times.
Speaking of local authorities, Alexander Nix very kindly says, excellent, very informative. Thank you, Alexander. We only deal with a few of these as a local authority, but they are very useful in preventing and managing complaints about noise once work starts. And that's our experience as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really helps that community engagement.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's that aspect of community engagement. More often than not, irrespective of whether or not the monitoring is even if it, for want of a better word, wasn't even operating on site, the very fact that if you install monitors, more often than not, that appeases a local resident, because they can see that the site are being diligent and are then taking the works very seriously. And more often than not, that's what, in our experience, local residents and in fact local authorities want. They just want to be reassured that any complaints or concerns are being listened to. Hopefully that covers most of them. Please feel free that if there's any more that crop up, feel free to email them to us, and we can circulate along with the presentation that we're going to send out via email afterwards. We'll circulate a list of the questions that were raised and responses to them, so that you've got those for future reference. Once again, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you for the next one.
Thank you.